This 19th century portrait shows something impossible that no one could explain until now. Michael Turner had developed a practiced eye for spotting historical significance in overlooked objects. At 47 years old, he'd spent 2 decades as a specialist in African American history, working primarily as an independent researcher and consultant for museums and historical societies across the South. His expertise lay in uncovering stories that had been deliberately hidden, erased, or forgotten, stories that challenged comfortable narratives about the past. This particular Thursday afternoon found him in a cramped antique shop in Montgomery, Alabama, a city whose streets still whispered with the echoes of its complicated history. The shop, called Southern Treasures, occupied a narrow building that had once been a dry goods store in the late 1800s. Its current owner, an elderly white man named Howard Preston, had inherited the business from his father and seemed more interested in reading his newspaper than assisting customers. Michael moved slowly through the crowded aisles, past furniture with peeling veneer, boxes of tarnished silverware, stacks of old books, and walls covered with framed photographs and paintings. He'd learned long ago that the most valuable historical artifacts were often the ones that dealers didn't recognize as significant, the documents and images that contained stories their owners never bothered to read. In a back corner, partially hidden behind a stack of framed landscape paintings, Michael noticed a large photograph in an ornate gilt frame. He carefully moved the paintings aside and lifted the frame into better light. The photograph was remarkably well preserved, a professional studio portrait from the late 19th century. It showed a family of 6 posed in front of an impressive plantation-style mansion with white columns and a broad front porch. The image quality was exceptional. Sharp focus, excellent tonal range, clearly the work of a skilled photographer. The family consisted of 2 adults and 4 children. The father stood on the left, a stern-looking man in his 40s wearing a dark suit with a watch chain visible across his vest. The mother sat in an ornate chair in the center, her elaborate dress suggesting wealth and social status. 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, all appearing to be between 8 and 14 years old, were positioned around their parents in the formal arrangement typical of Victorian family portraits. But it was the 6th figure that made Michael's breath catch. Standing in the very center of the composition, positioned prominently in front of the mother's chair, was a young black girl who appeared to be approximately 10 years old. She wore an expensive white dress with lace trim and ribbon details, clothing that matched the quality and style of what the white children wore. Her hair was elaborately styled, her posture was straight and formal, and she gazed directly at the camera with an expression that Michael couldn't quite read. Was it dignity, defiance, fear, or some complex combination of all 3? The positioning was striking and unusual. In photographs from this era that included both white family members and black servants, the servants were typically positioned at the edges or in the background, often standing while the white family members sat, clearly marked as subordinate. But this girl occupied the central position, dressed as well as the white children, placed in a position of apparent importance. Yet something about the image felt deeply wrong to Michael's trained eye. The white family member's body language was stiff and uncomfortable in a way that went beyond typical Victorian photographic formality. None of them touched the black girl or acknowledged her presence with their positioning. There was a careful distance maintained, a deliberate separation despite the physical proximity. Michael turned the frame over carefully. On the backing, written in faded ink, was a notation. Whitmore family, Riverside Plantation, Greene County, Alabama, October 1895. He carried the photograph to the front counter, where Howard Preston glanced at it without much interest. "How much for this?" Michael asked. "Frame's probably worth more than the picture," Preston said dismissively. $75? Michael paid without hesitation, knowing that what he held was far more valuable than the shopkeeper realized, not in monetary terms, but in historical significance. As he wrapped the frame carefully and carried it to his car, his mind was already racing with questions. Who was this black girl positioned so prominently in a white family's portrait? What was her relationship to the Whitmores? And why, in 1895, Alabama, a time and place of rigid racial segregation and brutal enforcement of white supremacy, would a wealthy white family pose for a formal portrait with a black child dressed as their equal? The answers, Michael suspected, would reveal a story that someone had worked very hard to conceal. Michael's home office in Birmingham was lined with bookshelves containing reference materials on Southern history, photographic techniques, and African-American genealogy. His desk held a high-resolution scanner and calibrated monitor, tools essential for his work, examining historical documents and photographs. He carefully removed the 1895 photograph from its ornate frame, noting that the image had been professionally mounted on heavy archival board. The photograph itself was a gelatin silver print, typical of professional portrait studios in the 1890s. The quality suggested an expensive commission, not a casual snapshot, but a formal family portrait that would have cost considerable money. Michael placed the photograph on his scanner, setting it to capture the image at maximum resolution. As the scan completed and appeared on his monitor, he began examining every detail with professional scrutiny. The mansion in the background was substantial, a two-story structure with Greek Revival architectural elements common to prosperous plantations. The columns were well maintained, the porch floor appeared freshly painted, the grounds visible at the edges of the frame showed careful landscaping. This was a family of significant wealth. He zoomed in on each family member individually. The father, whose stern expression and rigid posture dominated the left side of the composition, wore clothing that suggested both prosperity and conservative taste. His hand rested on the shoulder of one of the white boys, a gesture of possession and patriarchal authority. The mother's elaborate dress would have been expensive, requiring significant yardage of fine fabric and skilled dressmaking. Her jewelry, visible even in the photograph, included what appeared to be a pearl necklace and matching earrings. Her expression was carefully neutral, though Michael detected a certain tension around her eyes and mouth. The three white children showed the typical discomfort of young people forced to hold still for a long photographic exposure. The boys wore matching dark suits, the girl a white dress with elaborate ruffles. All three looked directly at the camera with expressions that suggested they'd been instructed exactly how to pose. Then Michael focused on the black girl at the center of the image. He increased the magnification, studying her face, her clothing, her positioning, and her expression with intense concentration. Her dress was of equal quality to what the white girl wore, perhaps even more expensive, given the intricate lacework and the fine fabric visible even in the photograph. This was not clothing a servant would wear. This was clothing designed to display wealth and status. Her hair had been elaborately styled in a manner popular for wealthy girls of that era, carefully curled and decorated with ribbons. Someone had spent considerable time on her appearance, ensuring she looked prosperous and well cared for. But it was her expression that most captured Michael's attention. Unlike the white children, who showed typical childish discomfort with the photographic process, this girl's face displayed a more complex emotion. Her eyes met the camera directly with an intensity that seemed almost defiant. Her mouth was set in a firm line. Her posture was absolutely straight, almost rigid. Michael had examined thousands of historical photographs. He had learned to read the subtle signs of coercion, fear, and resistance in images of enslaved people and their descendants. This girl's expression spoke of someone performing a role, maintaining a facade, enduring something she had no choice but to endure. He examined the spatial relationships in the photograph more carefully. Despite the girl's central positioning, there was a careful gap maintained between her and each white family member. No one touched her. No one's clothing overlapped with hers. The composition created the visual impression of proximity while maintaining actual separation. This was deliberate. This photograph had been carefully staged to create a specific impression that this black girl was part of the family, cared for, valued, while simultaneously maintaining the racial boundaries that 1895 Alabama society demanded. Michael pulled up reference materials on his computer, searching for information about Greene County, Alabama, in the 1890s. What he found confirmed his suspicions about the historical context. Greene County had been a major cotton-producing area before the Civil War, with a black population that had outnumbered whites by a significant margin during slavery. After emancipation, many formerly enslaved people had remained in the area, working as sharecroppers or tenant farmers under conditions that often resembled slavery in all but name. By 1895, Reconstruction had long since ended, and the brief period of black political power and economic advancement had been crushed by violence, fraud, and the implementation of Jim Crow laws. Alabama had recently adopted a new state constitution designed specifically to disenfranchise black voters through literacy tests, poll taxes, and property requirements. This was not a time or place where a black child would be genuinely integrated into a white family's life or photograph unless there was a very specific reason, a reason important enough to override the rigid racial conventions of the era. Michael sat back in his chair, studying the image on his monitor. This photograph was evidence of something. The question was, evidence of what? Michael began his investigation the way he always did, with systematic research into public records and historical documents. The notation on the photograph's backing had provided essential information. The Whitmore family, Riverside Plantation, Greene County, Alabama, 1895. He started with census records, accessing the digitized archives through his academic database subscriptions. The 1900 federal census, the closest available to the photograph's date, showed the Whitmore family living in Greene County. The household head was listed as James Whitmore, age 47, occupation planter. His wife Margaret was listed as 41. 3 children were enumerated: James Jr., age 16, Robert, age 13, and Elizabeth, age 11. No black girl was listed as part of the household. Michael checked the 1890 census, but most of those records had been destroyed in a fire. He moved forward to the 1910 census. The Whitmore family still appeared, now with the children grown and some married. Still no mention of a black girl who would have been approximately 25 years old by that time. He searched property records for Greene County, looking for deeds and tax assessments related to Riverside Plantation. The records showed that James Whitmore had acquired the property in 1893, just 2 years before the photograph was taken. The transaction was listed as a purchase from the estate of Samuel Morrison, deceased. This caught Michael's attention. Who was Samuel Morrison? Why had his estate sold the property? He searched for Samuel Morrison in earlier census records and found him listed in the 1880 census as a planter in Greene County. But what made Michael's pulse quicken was the racial designation, B for black. Samuel Morrison had been a black landowner, unusual but not impossible in the period immediately following the Civil War, when some formerly enslaved people had managed to acquire property through various means. His household in 1880 included a wife, Clara, and one daughter listed as Sadie Morrison, age 5. Michael calculated quickly. If Sadie Morrison was 5 years old in 1880, she would have been approximately 20 in 1895. Too old to be the girl in the photograph, unless he searched for death records and found what he was looking for. Samuel Morrison died February 1892. Clara Morrison died March 1892. Both deaths attributed to influenza, occurring within weeks of each other. The couple had died when their daughter was approximately 17 years old. What had happened to her after their deaths? Had she inherited the property? Michael searched further and found a probate record from 1892. Samuel Morrison's will left his entire estate, including Riverside Plantation, to his daughter Sadie Morrison. The will appointed a local attorney, Martin Hayes, as executor and temporary guardian until Sadie reached the age of 21. Then, in 1893, just 1 year after Morrison's death, the property was sold to James Whitmore for what appeared to be significantly below market value. The sale documents listed the seller as Martin Hayes, acting as guardian and executor for the Morrison estate. Michael sat back, pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a picture. Samuel Morrison, a prosperous black farmer, had died along with his wife, leaving his teenage daughter as sole heir to valuable property. Within a year, that property had been sold to a white family for what appeared to be a bargain price. What had happened to Sadie Morrison? Had she consented to the sale? Had she received the proceeds? Or had something else occurred? Something that involved fraud, coercion, or worse? He pulled up the photograph on his monitor again, studying the black girl's face with new understanding. If Sadie Morrison had been 17 in 1892 when her parents died, she would have been approximately 20 in 1895 when this photograph was taken, far too old to be the child in the image. But Michael knew from painful historical experience that the story was rarely straightforward. He needed to dig deeper. He searched birth records for Greene County, looking for any children born to Samuel and Clara Morrison after the 1880 census. Alabama's vital records from this period were incomplete. Many births, especially in black communities, went unregistered or were recorded informally. Then he found it in the register of births kept by a black Baptist church in the county. Elizabeth Morrison, born to Samuel and Clara Morrison, March 15, 1885. Elizabeth, the same name as the Whitmore daughter listed in the 1900 census. Michael's hands trembled slightly as he calculated. Elizabeth Morrison, born in 1885, would have been approximately 10 years old in 1895, exactly the apparent age of the black girl in the photograph. The pieces were coming together, revealing a story of theft and exploitation that made Michael's stomach turn. Samuel Morrison had died, leaving behind not one daughter but two, an older daughter, Sadie, who was nearly an adult, and a younger daughter, Elizabeth, who was just 7 years old when her parents died. The property had been sold supposedly on behalf of Sadie. But what had happened to young Elizabeth, the true heir who would have inherited everything when she came of age? The photograph on his screen suddenly made terrible sense. This wasn't a portrait of a family with their adopted daughter or their well-treated servant. This was a portrait of a family posing with a child they were holding in illegal servitude, a child they were presenting to authorities or lawyers as well cared for, while systematically stealing her inheritance. Michael spent the next week immersed in Greene County historical records, traveling to the county courthouse and the state archives in Montgomery to examine original documents that hadn't been digitized. What he uncovered was a systematic pattern of fraud and exploitation. The probate records for Samuel Morrison's estate revealed the initial stages of the scheme. When Samuel and Clara Morrison died in 1892, their estate included Riverside Plantation, approximately 300 acres of prime agricultural land, along with livestock, farm equipment, and modest savings. The total value was assessed at approximately $8,000, a substantial sum for the time. The will clearly stated that the entire estate was to be held in trust for Samuel's daughters, with the older daughter, Sadie, receiving immediate access to a portion upon reaching age 21, and the younger daughter, Elizabeth, to receive her full inheritance upon reaching the same age. Attorney Martin Hayes had been appointed as executor and guardian. The initial probate documents appeared proper and legal. But then Michael found the irregularities. In March 1893, just 1 year after Morrison's death, Hayes had petitioned the court for permission to sell Riverside Plantation, claiming that maintaining the property was too expensive and that selling it was in the best interest of the Morrison heirs. The petition stated that the proceeds would be held in trust for the benefit of the children. The court, presided over by Judge William Thornton, a white man with known connections to the local planter class, had approved the sale with minimal scrutiny. The property was sold to James Whitmore for $3,500, less than half its assessed value. Michael found no evidence that Sadie Morrison, who was nearly 18 at the time and legally entitled to representation, had been consulted about the sale or had consented to it. More troubling, there was no subsequent accounting showing that the Morrison daughters had ever received the proceeds from the sale. He searched for records of what happened to Sadie Morrison after the sale. What he found was chilling. In June 1893, just 3 months after the property sale, there was a death certificate for Sarah Morrison, age 18, cause of death, typhoid fever. Sarah, likely a variant or error in recording Sadie's name, the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Had Sadie Morrison died of natural causes? Or had she met with foul play after questioning the sale of her family's property? Even more damning, the death certificate listed James Whitmore as the informant, the person who had reported the death to authorities. Why would the new owner of the Morrison plantation be the one reporting the death of the Morrison heir? With Sadie dead, the only remaining heir was young Elizabeth Morrison, who was just 8 years old. Under normal circumstances, she would have been placed with relatives or in an orphanage, with her inheritance held in trust until she reached adulthood. But Michael found no records of Elizabeth Morrison being placed anywhere. She simply disappeared from official documents. No mention in orphanage records, no placement with family members, no guardianship papers, nothing. Except for one telling detail. In the 1900 census, the Whitmore household included a servant, listed only as Lizzie Black, age 15, occupation domestic servant. Elizabeth Morrison, the rightful heir to Riverside Plantation, had been transformed from property owner to property. She was living in the house that should have been hers, but as a servant to the family that had stolen her inheritance. The photograph took on new and darker meaning. Michael now understood why it had been taken. In the 1890s, there were still some legal protections for orphaned children, and there were northern charitable organizations and church groups that occasionally investigated reports of abuse or exploitation of black children in the South. This photograph was evidence, false evidence, that could be shown to any inquiring authority. See, they could say, we're taking good care of the Morrison girl. She's dressed well, she's healthy, she's practically one of the family. The reality, Michael suspected, was far different from what the photograph portrayed. Elizabeth Morrison was being held in servitude, forced to work in the house that should have been hers, while the Whitmore family enjoyed the profits from land that they had obtained through fraud and possibly murder. Michael found one more document that confirmed his theory. In the Whitmore family papers, donated to the County Historical Society years earlier, there was a letter dated 1895 from attorney Martin Hayes to James Whitmore. In response to your inquiry, I advise that the photograph is an excellent precaution. Should any questions arise regarding the Morrison girl's welfare, you will have documentary evidence of proper care. I have prepared affidavits from yourself and Mrs. Whitmore attesting to her good treatment, which can be presented if needed. As we discussed, it is unlikely that any serious investigation will occur, but it is prudent to have such evidence available. The photograph hadn't been taken as a family memento. It had been commissioned specifically as evidence, as proof that could be used to deflect scrutiny or investigation. It was part of a carefully constructed lie. Michael returned to the photograph with new eyes, examining it not as a simple family portrait, but as a document of a crime. Every detail now carried additional meaning. Every element of composition revealed something about the exploitation it was designed to conceal. He zoomed in on Elizabeth Morrison's face, studying her expression with the knowledge of who she really was. This wasn't a servant girl, grateful for the kindness of her employers. This was a child who had lost everything: her parents, her home, her inheritance, her freedom, forced to pose for a photograph that would be used as evidence of her own oppression. The expensive white dress she wore wasn't a gift or a sign of affection. It was a costume, a prop, in an elaborate performance designed to deceive anyone who might question her treatment. Michael imagined the scene. Elizabeth being dressed up, positioned carefully in the center of the frame, instructed exactly how to stand and where to look, all while the family that had stolen her future arranged themselves around her. How much had she understood? At 10 years old, had she fully comprehended what had been taken from her? Did she remember her parents, remember living in Riverside Plantation as its rightful owner rather than its servant? Michael examined the spatial relationships in the photograph again. Despite Elizabeth's central position, she occupied a carefully isolated space. The white children flanked her, but maintained clear distance. Mrs. Whitmore sat behind her, but didn't touch her. Mr. Whitmore stood at the edge of the frame, his body language suggesting authority over everyone in the image, including, especially, the black girl at the center. This was a portrait of power and possession disguised as a portrait of family and care. Michael pulled up the 1900 census record again, looking at the entry for Lizzie, servant, age 15. The census taker had recorded her as able to read and write, unusual for a servant in rural Alabama at that time, but perfectly consistent with being the daughter of a prosperous farmer who had valued education. He searched for any other mentions of Elizabeth Morrison in historical records. In the 1910 census, the Whitmore household still included a domestic servant named Lizzie, now listed as 25 years old. By this age, Elizabeth should have long since inherited her parents' property and been a landowner in her own right. Instead, she remained a servant in her own home. Michael found scattered references in local records: a church registry that mentioned Lizzie from the Whitmore place attending services, a store ledger showing purchases charged to the Whitmore account and signed with Lizzie's mark, suggesting she was no longer able to write or was being prevented from doing so. Then, in 1918, he found a death certificate. Elizabeth Morrison, age 33, cause of death, influenza. The 1918 flu pandemic had killed millions worldwide, and it had hit black communities especially hard. Elizabeth had died in the same pandemic that had ravaged the world, in the same house where she should have been mistress, but had instead been a servant for 26 years. The death certificate listed her occupation as domestic servant. There was no mention of her parentage, no acknowledgement of who she really was. James Whitmore, now elderly, was listed as the informant. She was buried in the black section of the county cemetery in an unmarked grave. The Whitmores had not even provided a headstone for the woman who had served them for most of her life, the woman whose property they had built their prosperity upon. Michael sat in his office, looking at the photograph of 10-year-old Elizabeth Morrison dressed in expensive lace, positioned prominently in a family portrait, her expression dignified and defiant despite everything that had been done to her. This image was all that remained of her voice, her presence, her resistance. She had been erased from official records, robbed of her inheritance, forced into servitude, and buried in an unmarked grave. But this photograph survived, and now, more than a century later, it was finally revealing the truth it had been created to conceal. Michael knew he needed to find out if Elizabeth had any descendants, any family who deserved to know her story, but the record suggested she had died unmarried and childless. Another loss attributable to the Whitmores, who had controlled every aspect of her life and denied her the possibility of building a family of her own. However, he remembered the older sister, Sadie Morrison, who had died suspiciously in 1893. If Sadie had married or had children before her death, there might be descendants who carried the Morrison line, descendants who deserved to know about their family's stolen inheritance. Michael's search for descendants of the Morrison family proved challenging. Sadie Morrison had died at 18, and records from that era, especially for black families in rural Alabama, were fragmentary at best. But Michael had decades of experience with genealogical research, and he knew how to find the traces that official records missed. He started with church records. The Black Baptist Church that had recorded Elizabeth Morrison's birth in 1885 had maintained relatively complete records of baptisms, marriages, and deaths for its congregation. The church still existed, though it now occupied a modern building rather than the simple wooden structure that had served the community in the 1890s. The current pastor, Reverend Marcus Washington, was a man in his 60s who took evident pride in his church's history. When Michael explained his research, Reverend Washington welcomed him and brought out the congregation's historical records, carefully preserved in archival boxes. "The Morrison family were members here," Reverend Washington said, turning pages in a leather-bound registry. "Samuel Morrison was a deacon, respected man. His death was a great loss to the community." Michael found the entry for Sadie Morrison's baptism in 1875 and Elizabeth's in 1885, but he also found something he hadn't expected. In the marriage register for 1891, there was an entry for Sarah Morrison, age 16, married to Thomas Hayes, age 19, June 14, 1891. Sarah Morrison, the variant of Sadie's name. She had married just 1 year before her parents died. "Thomas Hayes," Michael said aloud. "Any relation to Martin Hayes, the attorney?" Reverend Washington's expression darkened. "Martin Hayes' nephew. That was a troubled situation. Thomas was a good young man from what the old records suggest, but his uncle—" He shook his head. "There were rumors even then about Martin Hayes and his business practices." Michael searched for further records of Thomas Hayes and found a death certificate from 1893, the same year as Sadie's death. Thomas Hayes had died in April 1893, just 1 month before Sadie's death was recorded. Cause of death? Farm accident. 2 deaths in the same year, both shortly after the suspicious sale of the Morrison property. The pattern was too clear to ignore, but the marriage record meant that there might have been children. Michael searched baptismal records and found it. James Samuel Hayes, born to Thomas and Sarah Hayes, February 1892. Sadie Morrison had given birth to a son just weeks before her parents died. The baby would have been only a year old when his mother died, only a few weeks old when his father died. What had happened to this child? Michael searched adoption records, foster care placements, and orphanage admissions, but found nothing under the name James Hayes. Then Reverend Washington suggested something. In those days, when children were orphaned, they were often taken in by family members informally. No official records, just family caring for family. If the Hayes boy survived, he might have been raised by relatives under a different name, or simply integrated into another household. Michael expanded his search, looking for any mention of a James Hayes or a child of approximately the right age being raised by Hayes family members. What he found eventually was in the 1900 census. Living with Martin Hayes, the attorney who had engineered the theft of the Morrison property, was a ward listed as James Martin, age 8, relation, ward. James Martin. Not James Hayes, but close enough that Michael suspected a connection. The age matched perfectly. A child born in 1892 would indeed be 8 years old in 1900. Michael traced this James Martin through subsequent records. He appeared in the 1910 census, still living with Martin Hayes, now listed as age 18, occupation clerk. By 1920, he had moved to Birmingham and was working as a bookkeeper. He married in 1922 to a woman named Dorothy Williams, and they had 3 children between 1923 and 1929. The trail led to Birmingham, where Michael lived. Could there be descendants of the Morrison family living in his own city, unaware of their heritage? Michael traced the children of James Martin through marriage records, death certificates, and census data. One son had died in World War II. One daughter had moved to Chicago and died there in the 1980s. But the youngest child, a daughter named Ruth, had remained in Birmingham. She had married a man named Robert Foster and had 2 children. Following the trail forward to the present day, Michael found that Ruth Foster had died in 2015, but her daughter, her granddaughter of James Martin, was still alive. Her name was Patricia Foster Reynolds, and she lived in Birmingham. Michael sat back, absorbing the significance of what he'd discovered. Patricia Foster Reynolds was the great-great-granddaughter of Sadie Morrison and the great-great-great-granddaughter of Samuel Morrison. She was the closest living descendant of the family that had owned Riverside Plantation. She was the heir to a stolen inheritance, though that inheritance was now more than a century gone. He picked up the phone to call her, then hesitated. How do you tell someone that their family was robbed of a fortune? How do you explain that their great-great-grandmother was likely murdered? That their great-great-great-aunt was held in servitude in her own home until she died? How do you reveal a history of injustice that can never be repaired? Michael took a deep breath and dialed the number. Patricia Foster Reynolds answered on the 3rd ring, her voice warm but cautious. Hello? Ms. Foster Reynolds, my name is Michael Turner. I'm a historian specializing in African American history in Alabama. I've been researching a family called Morrison who lived in Greene County in the late 1800s, and I believe they may be your ancestors. Would you be willing to speak with me about what I've discovered? There was a pause. Morrison? I don't recognize that name from my family history. Your great-great-grandfather was James Martin, correct? Born around 1892? Yes, that's right. He was raised by an uncle, I think. My grandmother didn't talk much about that side of the family. That's because your great-great-grandfather's birth name was James Hayes, and his mother's maiden name was Morrison. There's a significant family history that I believe you should know about. Another pause, longer this time. What kind of history? It's complicated and it's painful. I'd prefer to explain it in person if you're willing to meet. I have documents and photographs I'd like to show you. Patricia agreed to meet him 2 days later at a coffee shop near her home in Birmingham's South Side neighborhood. Michael spent those 2 days organizing his research materials, creating a timeline of events, and preparing copies of all the relevant documents. The property records, the death certificates, the census data, the church records, and especially the photograph. When they met, Patricia was a woman in her early 50s, with a calm, professional demeanor that suggested someone accustomed to handling difficult information. She worked as a social worker, she explained, and had spent her career dealing with family traumas and complicated histories. I appreciate you being willing to meet with me, Michael began. What I'm going to share with you is a story about your family that's been hidden for more than a century. Some of it is painful. All of it is unjust. I want you to know that before we start. Patricia nodded, her expression serious. I understand. Please, go ahead. Michael laid out the story methodically, starting with Samuel Morrison and his success as a black landowner in Greene County. He showed her the census records, the property deeds, the evidence of a prosperous family that had built something valuable during a time when that was extraordinarily difficult for black families to achieve. Then he explained the deaths of Samuel and Clara Morrison in 1892, and how their property had been sold under suspicious circumstances by a white attorney who was supposed to be protecting their daughter's interests. He showed her the death certificates for both Sadie Morrison Hayes and Thomas Hayes, both dying young in 1893, both dying shortly after questioning the sale of the family property. Your great-great-grandfather, James, was the son of Sadie Morrison, Michael explained gently. He was just over a year old when his mother died, only a few weeks old when his father died. He was raised by Martin Hayes, the attorney who had stolen his family's inheritance, and he apparently never knew who he really was or what had been taken from his family. Patricia's hands trembled slightly as she held the documents. My grandmother always said there was something sad about her father, something he never talked about. She thought maybe he'd been orphaned young and didn't like to discuss it. He was orphaned, Michael confirmed. But there's more. Sadie Morrison had a younger sister, Elizabeth, who was only 7 years old when their parents died. He placed the 1895 photograph on the table between them. Patricia stared at the image, her eyes drawn immediately to the black girl at the center. Who is this? That's Elizabeth Morrison, your great-great-great-aunt, the rightful heir to Riverside Plantation. This photograph was taken when she was 10 years old, 3 years after her parents died and after the property that should have been hers was stolen by the Whitmore family. Michael explained the fraud, the illegal servitude, the photograph commissioned as false evidence of Elizabeth's good treatment. He showed Patricia the census records that listed Elizabeth as a servant, the death certificate that recorded her death at 33 with no acknowledgement of who she really was or what had been taken from her. Patricia listened in silence, tears streaming down her face. When Michael finished, she sat quietly for a long moment, looking at the photograph of Elizabeth Morrison. She was held as a slave, Patricia said finally. 30 years after slavery ended, she was held as a slave in her own home. Essentially, yes. The law said she was free, but the reality was servitude enforced by fraud, isolation, and the threat of violence that hung over every black person in the South during that era. And my great-great-grandfather never knew that his mother had been murdered, that his aunt had been enslaved, that his family had owned valuable property? I don't believe so. Martin Hayes raised him under a different name, cut him off from his heritage, ensured he never questioned his origins or his rights. Patricia touched the photograph gently, her finger hovering over Elizabeth's face. She looked so dignified, so strong, even knowing what they were doing to her. She was, Michael agreed. And now, after more than a century, her story can finally be told. Your family's story can finally be told. Well, over the following weeks, Michael worked with Patricia to piece together more details of the Morrison family history. They visited the Greene County Courthouse together, examined the original property records, and walked the grounds of what had once been Riverside Plantation. The plantation itself had changed hands several times since the Whitmore family had owned it. In the 1950s, it had been subdivided and sold to multiple buyers. The grand house that appeared in the 1895 photograph had burned down in 1968. Now the property was home to a modern housing development, with neat suburban homes covering the land that Samuel Morrison had once farmed. Standing on what had been the plantation's front lawn, Patricia looked out over the subdivision and shook her head. All of this should have been ours. My grandmother grew up poor, my mother struggled, I've worked hard for everything I have, and all along, my family's inheritance was here, stolen from us. Michael understood her pain, but he also knew he had to be honest. There's no legal remedy. Too much time has passed, and the law wouldn't have protected Elizabeth, even when the theft was happening. In 1895, Alabama, the courts were complicit in the exploitation of black families. Even if we could prove the fraud, which we can, there's no way to recover what was lost. Patricia nodded, wiping tears from her eyes. I know. I'm not looking for money or property. I need to know the truth. I need to honor them. Sadie and Elizabeth and Samuel and Clara. They deserve to be remembered. They visited the county cemetery, finding the black section where Elizabeth Morrison had been buried. The grave was unmarked, impossible to identify among dozens of other unmarked graves from the same era. We could place a headstone, Patricia said. Finally give her a marker, recognition of who she was. We could, Michael agreed. But we need to be careful about how we tell this story. The Whitmore family still has descendants in Greene County. Some of them are prominent in the community. If we go public with accusations of fraud and murder... I don't care about their comfort, Patricia said sharply. They built their prosperity on my family's stolen land. They held my great-great-great-aunt as a slave for 26 years. Why should I protect them? Michael chose his words carefully. I'm not asking you to protect them. I'm asking you to think about what you want from this. Do you want confrontation? Do you want to pursue some kind of public acknowledgement? Or do you want to focus on honoring your ancestors and preserving their memory? Patricia was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, I want the truth to be known. I want Elizabeth's story to be told, but you're right. I don't want this to become a spectacle. This isn't entertainment. This is my family's tragedy. They decided on a measured approach. Patricia would fund a headstone for Elizabeth Morrison to be placed in the cemetery with a simple inscription, Elizabeth Morrison, 1885 and 1918, daughter of Samuel and Clara Morrison, beloved and remembered. Michael would document the Morrison family history in his research files, making it available to scholars and historians, but not publishing it in popular media. The truth would be preserved in the historical record without becoming sensationalized. They made one more trip to Greene County to visit the church where the Morrison family had worshipped. Reverend Washington welcomed them and listened as Patricia explained what Michael had discovered. "I'd like to make a donation to the church," Patricia said, "in memory of Samuel and Clara Morrison and their daughters, Sadie and Elizabeth. They were members here, and I want to honor that connection." Reverend Washington accepted gratefully, and he promised that the Morrison family would be remembered in the church's historical records and commemorations. As they drove back to Birmingham, Patricia held the framed photograph in her lap, studying Elizabeth's face. "What do you think she would want?" she asked Michael. "If she could speak to us now, what would she want us to do?" Michael thought about the question carefully. "I think she'd want to be remembered. Not as a victim, though she was victimized. Not as a servant, though she was forced into servitude. But as who she really was. Samuel Morrison's daughter, the rightful heir to Riverside Plantation, a person with dignity and worth who survived something terrible with her humanity intact." "That's what the photograph shows," Patricia said softly. "Look at her face. They dressed her up, positioned her like a prop, tried to use her image to cover their crime. But she's looking right at the camera, right through all their lies. She's saying, 'I know who I am. I know what you're doing. And someday, someone will see the truth.'" Michael felt chills. Patricia was right. Elizabeth's expression in the photograph was not submission or gratitude. It was witness. She was bearing witness to her own exploitation, leaving evidence that would outlast all the people who had wronged her. "She's speaking to us," Patricia continued. "Across more than a century, she's telling her story, and now we've finally heard it." Despite the extensive research, many questions remained unanswered, and Michael knew they likely always would be. The historical record, especially for black families in the post-Reconstruction South, was fragmentary and incomplete, full of silences and erasures that could never be fully recovered. What had Elizabeth's daily life been like in the Whitmore household? The census records and the photograph provided glimpses, but they couldn't capture the texture of her experience, the labor she performed, the treatment she received, the thoughts and feelings she had as she lived in the house that should have been hers. Had she maintained any memory of her parents? At 7 years old when they died, she would have had some recollection of Samuel and Clara Morrison, some sense of who she had been before the Whitmores took control of her life. Had she remembered being free? Had she told herself the truth in the privacy of her own mind, even as she was forced to live a lie? Had the Whitmore children known the truth? In the photograph, they appeared to be between 8 and 14 years old. Old enough to understand, certainly, that Elizabeth was different, that she occupied a strange position in their household. But had they known she was the rightful owner of their home? Had they been complicit in the deception, or had they simply accepted the situation as children accept what adults tell them? Michael had found no evidence that any member of the Whitmore family had ever expressed regret or acknowledged the truth. James Whitmore died in 1924, his obituary praising him as a successful planter and pillar of the community. His wife Margaret died in 1931. Their children lived comfortable lives, benefiting from prosperity built on stolen land. The Whitmore family's descendants still lived in Alabama. Michael had identified several of them through genealogical research. Some were prominent in their communities: lawyers, business owners, politicians. None appeared to have any knowledge of the true history of Riverside Plantation or the Morrison family. Should they be told? Did they have a right to know that their family's wealth was founded on theft and exploitation? Or would revealing that history only cause pain without possibility of remedy? Patricia struggled with these questions too. "Part of me wants to confront them," she admitted to Michael during one of their many conversations. "I want to walk up to them and say, 'Your great-grandfather stole from my family. Your prosperity is built on our loss.' But what would that accomplish?" "It would be truth-telling," Michael said. "And truth-telling has value, even when it can't change material outcomes. But it would also be me taking on the burden of their guilt. I'd have to carry their shame as well as my family's grief. And for what? They're not going to give anything back. They're not going to apologize. Most of them probably don't even know the truth." Michael understood her conflict. This was the fundamental problem with historical injustice. The people who committed the crimes were long dead. The people who benefited from those crimes were often unaware of their complicity, and the people who suffered had no recourse for justice. There was another question that haunted both of them. What had happened to Sadie Morrison? Her death certificate listed typhoid fever as the cause, but the timing, just months after the property sale, just weeks after her husband's death, suggested something more sinister. Had she died of natural causes, or had she been murdered? If she had been murdered, who was responsible? Martin Hayes, who had financial motive to eliminate the Morrison heirs? James Whitmore, who had acquired the property and might have wanted no witnesses to the fraud? Or someone else entirely? The evidence was circumstantial and incomplete. There was no way to prove murder more than a century after the fact. But the pattern was clear. Everyone who might have challenged the theft of Morrison property had died young and conveniently. "I think about Sadie a lot," Patricia said. "She was only 18, younger than my daughter is now. She had a baby. She should have had a whole life ahead of her, raising her son, maybe having more children, running the family farm, building on what her parents had created. Instead, she died and was buried in an unmarked grave, and her son grew up never knowing who his mother really was." Michael had located Sadie's grave, or at least the area of the cemetery where she was likely buried. Like Elizabeth, she had no headstone. Patricia purchased markers for both sisters, finally giving them recognition more than a century after their deaths. The questions would remain unanswered. The full truth would never be known. But at least now, Elizabeth and Sadie Morrison had names, had stories, had descendants who honored their memory and acknowledged what had been done to them. 6 months after discovering the photograph, Michael sat in his office organizing the Morrison family research files. He had documented everything he'd found: the property records, the census data, the death certificates, the church records, the photograph itself, and his interviews with Patricia Foster Reynolds. The file would be preserved in his personal archive and eventually donated to a university collection that specialized in African American history. Researchers in future generations would have access to the truth about the Morrison family, even if that truth could never result in justice or restitution. Patricia had decided not to pursue any public revelation of the Whitmore family's crimes. "I thought about it a lot," she explained when they met for coffee one final time. "I imagined confronting them, demanding acknowledgement, making sure everyone knew what their ancestors did. But in the end, I realized that wouldn't serve Elizabeth or Sadie or Samuel and Clara. It would just be transferring my pain onto other people, most of whom had nothing to do with what happened." "So what will you do instead?" Michael asked. "I'm going to focus on remembering my family, really remembering them, not as victims, but as people. Samuel Morrison was a successful farmer who built something valuable. Clara was his partner in that work. Sadie was a young mother who tried to protect her son. Elizabeth was a survivor who endured something unimaginable and maintained her dignity through it all." She pulled out the photograph, which Michael had given to her along with a high-resolution digital copy. "This picture was meant to be evidence of a lie, but it's become evidence of the truth. Every time I look at it, I see Elizabeth looking back at me, and I know that she's finally been seen, finally been heard, finally been honored." Patricia had shared the Morrison family history with her children and grandchildren. They now knew that they were descended from landowners, not servants, that their family had been prosperous before that prosperity was stolen. "That knowledge changed something," Patricia said. "It gave them a different sense of who they were and what they came from." "My grandson asked me if we were going to try to get the land back," Patricia said with a sad smile. "He's 14, and he has this beautiful sense of justice, this belief that wrongs can be made right. I had to explain to him that some injustices can't be fixed, that sometimes all we can do is remember and honor those who suffered." Michael understood. He'd spent his career documenting injustices that could never be remedied: slavery, segregation, violence, theft, exploitation. The work could be heartbreaking, but it was also necessary. Truth-telling mattered, even when truth-telling couldn't change material outcomes. "What will you do with the photograph?" he asked Patricia. "I'm going to frame it and hang it in my home where my family can see it every day. And I'm going to tell Elizabeth's story to everyone who asks about it. Not the whole complicated history that's preserved in your research, but the essential truth, that this was Elizabeth Morrison, rightful heir to Riverside Plantation, who was robbed of her inheritance and held in servitude for 26 years, and that despite everything that was done to her, she survived with her dignity intact." She paused, touching the photograph gently. "I'm also going to tell people that she was loved. Her parents loved her enough to build something valuable to pass on to her. Her sister loved her. I believe Sadie tried to protect her before she died. And now, more than a century later, she's loved by descendants who finally know her name and her story." Michael thought about the purpose of his work, about why he spent his life uncovering painful histories. It wasn't about assigning blame or demanding reparations, though both of those had their place. It was about this, about giving people like Patricia the knowledge of where they came from, about restoring names and stories to people who had been deliberately erased from history. "Elizabeth Morrison," he said aloud. "Samuel and Clara Morrison. Sadie Morrison Hayes. Now they're remembered. Now their story is part of the record. That's not justice, but it's something." "It's everything," Patricia corrected gently. "For too long they existed only as footnotes or not at all. Now they exist as people, as my people. That matters more than you might think." They parted that day with mutual respect and a shared understanding of what they had accomplished and what they hadn't. The Morrison family's stolen inheritance would never be recovered. The Whitmores would never face consequences for their crimes. The injustice would never be made right. But Elizabeth Morrison would no longer be forgotten. She would no longer be just a mysterious black child in a white family's photograph. She had a name, a history, a family who honored her memory. She had been seen, finally truly seen, across the gap of more than a century. Michael returned to his office and filed the research materials carefully. Someday, perhaps, another researcher would find this file and build upon his work. Someday, perhaps, more of the story would be uncovered. But for now, it was enough to have given Elizabeth Morrison her voice back, to have documented the truth that the photograph had been created to conceal. The image that was meant to hide a crime had instead preserved evidence of that crime, waiting patiently for more than a century until someone cared enough to look closely and see what was really there. Truth, Michael reflected, had a way of surviving. It could be buried, obscured, deliberately hidden, but it rarely disappeared completely. And when it finally emerged, it had the power to change how people understood themselves and their history. The photograph sat on his desk one last time before he sent it home with Patricia. Elizabeth Morrison gazed out from the image, 10 years old, dressed in expensive lace, positioned prominently in a family portrait that should never have existed. She was no longer silent. Her story was no longer hidden. And that, perhaps, was the only victory possible in a history defined by injustice, that the truth eventually could no longer be denied.